Your sister built everything on her own, unlike you, my mother said, loud enough for every single person at that dinner table to hear, and the worst part wasn't the words themselves, it was the way the room reacted, the quiet pause followed by polite laughter, the kind people give when they're not sure if they should feel uncomfortable or impressed, and I remember sitting there, hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling every pair of eyes shift toward me as if I had just been introduced as a disappointment instead of a daughter, and I didn't interrupt her, I didn't correct her, I didn't even look up right away because I had learned a long time ago that in my family, reacting too quickly only made things worse, so I let her continue, I let her stand there with that proud smile, holding her glass like she was making a toast worth remembering, praising my sister as if she had built her success from nothing, as if there hadn't been years of quiet support behind the scenes that nobody ever acknowledged, and my sister, of course, didn't stop her, she just smiled softly, the kind of smile that looks humble on the surface but feels like victory when you know the full story, and someone down the table added, she's always been the driven one, which earned a few nods, a few approving looks, and I could feel the narrative settling into place around me, the same one I had lived with for years, the reliable daughter who keeps things running quietly while someone else takes the credit, and still, I stayed calm. I even lifted my glass slightly, not to toast, but just to keep my hands from tightening, because there's a certain kind of discipline that comes from being underestimated for too long. You learn to control your expressions, your tone, even your breathing, and I remember thinking very clearly in that moment that this wasn't new. This was just the most public version of something that had been happening for years, only now it had an audience, now it had witnesses, now it had people who would walk away believing a version of the story that erased me completely, and my mother wasn't finished, she went on, her voice smooth and certain, saying, Tige has always needed a little more guidance, and that word, guidance, landed heavier than anything else because it sounded kind, it sounded reasonable, but it rewrote everything I had done into something smaller, something dependent, something that required supervision instead of strength. And I noticed a few people glance at me again, waiting, maybe expecting a reaction, maybe hoping for one. Because moments like that tend to turn into quiet entertainment when nobody stops them, and I could have spoken then, I could have corrected her in real time, I could have listed every detail she had left out, but I didn't, not yet, because there's a difference between reacting and choosing the right moment, and I had learned that timing matters more than volume, so I sat there, composed, letting her finish. Letting the room settle into that version of reality, letting my sister accept praise that didn't fully belong to her, and in that silence, something shifted for me, not emotionally, but strategically. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just a pattern, it was a decision they were making, to present me a certain way, to define me in front of others without expecting any resistance, and that's when I finally looked up, not quickly, not sharply, just calmly, meeting my mother's eyes with the same level of respect I had always shown her, and I smiled, not out of agreement, but because I understood something she didn't, that the story she was telling was about to change, and I let the silence stretch just a little longer before speaking, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't immediate, it's measured, and I hadn't said anything, yet. No one spoke right away after I looked up, and that silence felt heavier than anything my mother had said because it shifted the attention without me having to raise my voice, and I could see it in the way a few people leaned slightly forward, waiting, as if they sensed something was about to change but could not yet explain why, and my mother, still holding her glass, gave a small, almost dismissive smile like she expected me to agree, like she expected me to stay in the role she had already assigned me, and for a brief second, I almost did what I had always done, I almost nodded politely and let the moment pass, but then my sister spoke, and that is what made the difference. She let out a soft laugh and said, I mean, I worked really hard for everything I have, and the way she said it was not aggressive, it was not loud, it was controlled, but it carried just enough confidence to make it sound like a final statement, like a truth that did not need to be questioned, and a few people at the table murmured in agreement, one of my cousins even said, that is obvious. And I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not even frustration, but clarity, because in that moment I realized they were not just repeating a misunderstanding, they were reinforcing a version of reality that benefited them, and I had been allowing it by staying quiet for far too long, so I adjusted slightly in my chair, placed my glass down carefully so it would not make a sound, and when I spoke, I made sure my voice was calm, steady, and respectful, the same way I had always addressed my parents. "I am glad you feel proud of your work," I said, looking directly at my sister first before turning to my mother, "and I appreciate you recognizing effort," and for a second, my words seemed to confirm what they expected. I could see my mother relax just slightly, thinking I was about to agree with her narrative, but I did not stop there. I let a small pause form, not long enough to feel dramatic, just enough to hold attention, and then I continued, "I just think it is important that we present the full picture, especially when we are discussing how things were built," and that was when the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, because my tone had not changed. It was still polite, still measured, but the meaning behind it was no longer passive, and my sister's expression tightened just a fraction, almost imperceptible unless you were looking directly at her, and my mother lowered her glass slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to understand where I was going without wanting to interrupt, and someone near the end of the table let out a quiet breath, the kind people make when they realize a conversation is no longer casual, and I kept my posture straight, my hands relaxed, because this was not about raising my voice, it was about choosing my words carefully. "Mom," I said, addressing her directly now, "when you say she built everything on her own, I understand what you mean, but I think it might give the wrong impression if we do not clarify certain details," and that was enough to break the surface tension completely, because now it was clear I was not simply responding, I was correcting, and my sister shifted in her seat, crossing her arms slightly, not in a defensive way that would draw attention, but enough to signal discomfort, and my father, who had been quiet until then, finally looked up from his plate, his expression neutral but alert, as if he was trying to decide whether to step in or stay out of it, and my mother gave a small, controlled laugh, the kind she used when she wanted to smooth things over without actually addressing the issue. "Tige," she said, her tone light but firm, "this is not the time to get into technicalities," and there it was, the familiar pattern, minimize, redirect, move on, but this time I did not follow it. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her without challenging her tone, and replied, "I understand, and I will keep it brief," and I could feel the attention sharpen around me. People who had been casually eating were now fully focused, forks paused mid-air, conversations at the edges of the room fading out completely, because even though nothing dramatic had happened yet, everyone could sense that something was about to be revealed, and I took a quiet breath, not out of nerves, but to make sure every word that followed would land exactly the way it needed to, because I was no longer responding to a comment, I was about to change the entire direction of the conversation, and this time, I was not going to let it be rewritten once I started speaking. I did not rush the next sentence, because I knew once I said it, there would be no returning to the version of me they were comfortable with, so I kept my tone steady and respectful, the same tone I had always used in that house. "The company that you are referring to," I said calmly, letting my eyes move across the table so no one felt excluded from what I was about to explain, was registered 3 years ago under Monroe Holdings, and the initial capital that funded it did not come from nowhere, and that was the first real shift, because now people were no longer just listening, they were processing, trying to connect pieces they had never been given before, and I could see it in the way my uncle leaned back slightly, his expression changing from passive interest to focused attention, while my sister's posture stiffened, her shoulders pulling back as if she was bracing for something she did not want said out loud, and my mother's smile faded just enough to reveal concern, not panic yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when control begins to slip, and she interrupted lightly, still trying to keep the tone casual, "Tige, we all know your sister worked very hard," but I nodded immediately, not challenging her, not raising my voice, just continuing with the same calm clarity. "She did, and I respect that. This is not about effort, it is about structure," and that word landed differently, because it shifted the conversation from emotion to facts, and facts are harder to dismiss once they are introduced properly, and I could feel the room settle into a deeper silence, the kind where even small movements become noticeable, glasses being set down more carefully, chairs no longer shifting, and I continued, "The legal ownership of the holding company is not in her name," and I paused there, not for effect, but to allow the statement to be understood fully, because I knew most of them would not immediately grasp what that meant, and then I added, still composed, "It is in mine," and this time the silence was complete, not polite, not uncertain, but absolute, the kind that fills a room when something undeniable has just been placed in front of everyone. And my sister's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she looked away, as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of what had just been said, and my mother set her glass down a little too quickly, the sound sharper than anything else in the room, and my father straightened in his chair, his attention now fully on me, no longer neutral, no longer distant, and someone near the far end of the table whispered, "Wait, what?" under their breath, not loudly enough to interrupt, but enough to confirm that the narrative had broken, and I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it sit, because this was the moment where everything they had assumed began to unravel on its own, and then my sister finally spoke, her voice controlled but tighter than before. "That is not what we agreed on," and I turned to her gently, not confrontational, not dismissive, just precise. "What we agreed on was that I would structure the foundation so the company could launch without external risk," and I kept my tone even, making sure every word remained clear and respectful, which included capital, legal protection, and operational backing during the first 18 months, and now the room was no longer just listening, it was recalculating, because those were not small contributions. Those were the elements that determine whether something survives or fails, and my mother tried again, her voice softer now, more cautious. "Tige, this is not necessary," but I met her gaze calmly and replied, "I believe it is, especially if we are discussing who built what," and there was no sharpness in my words, no accusation, just clarity, and that made it harder to dismiss, because I was not attacking, I was correcting, and the distinction mattered, and I could see it in the way the people around the table were no longer looking at my sister with automatic admiration, but with curiosity, even doubt, and my father finally spoke, slower than usual, "Are you saying the entire structure depends on you?" And I answered simply, "I am saying it was designed that way from the beginning," and I did not elaborate further, because I did not need to. The implication was already clear, and for the first time that evening, my sister did not have a response ready, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet tension that she could not hide, and my mother, who had started this moment with certainty, now sat in silence, her expression caught between disbelief and realization, and I remained exactly where I was, composed, respectful, and completely in control of the conversation they had not expected me to take. The silence did not break immediately, and that was what made it heavier, because now it was no longer about what I had said, it was about what everyone else was realizing, and I could see it spreading slowly across the table, the quiet shift in posture, the way people avoided looking directly at my sister, the way my mother's expression tightened as if she was trying to recover control without knowing where to begin, and my father remained still, his gaze fixed on me with a level of attention he had never shown before, not dismissive, not distracted, but fully engaged, as if he was hearing me for the first time. And my sister finally leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, more controlled. "You are making this sound misleading," she said, choosing her words carefully, and I nodded once, acknowledging her without interrupting. "Then please clarify," I replied calmly, giving her the space to respond, because I knew she would not be able to without exposing more than she intended. And she hesitated, just for a second, but in a room that quiet, hesitation speaks louder than confidence, and she adjusted her tone, trying to regain footing. "You helped in the beginning, yes, but I built everything after that," and there it was, the attempt to minimize, to isolate my involvement to something temporary, something supportive but not essential, and I did not challenge her directly. I simply continued with the same measured clarity. "The operational accounts are still tied to the original structure," I said, keeping my voice even, "and that structure has not changed," and I let that settle for a moment before adding, "which means every major decision, including expansion and funding approval, still routes through the holding entity," and I did not need to say more than that, because anyone with even a basic understanding of business could follow the implication, and I could see it register across the table. The realization that control is not always visible, and that ownership does not always match the person standing in front of the room receiving applause. And my mother exhaled quietly, placing both hands on the table now, no longer holding her glass, no longer performing, just present in a way she had not been minutes earlier, and she said my name, softer this time, "Tige," as if she was trying to reset the tone, but there was no dismissal in it anymore, only uncertainty, and I met her gaze respectfully, not cold, not distant, just steady. Because this was not about disrespect, it was about accuracy, and my father finally spoke again, slower, more deliberate. So if the structure depends on you, what happens if you step away? And that question changed everything, because it was no longer about past contributions, it was about present control, and I answered without hesitation, the structure remains intact, I said, but operational authority would be paused until a transition is formally executed, and I kept my tone neutral, not threatening, not dramatic, just factual, because facts carry more weight when they are delivered without emotion. And the reaction this time was immediate, not loud, but visible. My sister's composure slipped just enough for it to show, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table, her expression no longer confident, but calculating, and my mother looked between us, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to concern, as if she was beginning to understand the full extent of what had been overlooked, and someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. Quietly, not to speak, but to release the tension that had been building, and I remained exactly where I was, composed, not raising my voice, not leaning forward, not changing my posture, because the power in that moment did not come from force, it came from control, and I had already established that, and my sister tried once more, her tone sharper now, though still restrained. Are you saying I do not have control over my own company? And I looked at her calmly, without hostility, without hesitation. I am saying the company operates within a framework that was designed to protect it, I replied, and that framework is still active, and I did not expand further, because I did not need to. The meaning was already clear, and the room understood it, not in pieces, but all at once, the shift, the imbalance, the truth that had been hidden behind a simpler story, and for the first time that evening, no one laughed, no one added a comment, no one tried to smooth things over, because there was nothing left to soften, only something to accept, and I could feel it settle, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, the moment where the narrative changed and did not change back. No one tried to interrupt after that, and that was when I understood the shift had already happened, not because I forced it, but because the truth had finally been placed where everyone could see it, and once that happens, it becomes very difficult to go back to a simpler version of events. And I could feel the weight of that realization settling across the table, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way people stopped pretending this was still just a casual dinner conversation, and my mother was the first to move again, slowly adjusting her posture as if she was trying to regain some sense of control over the situation, but her voice, when she spoke, was different now, softer, measured. Tige, we did not mean to misrepresent anything, she said. And I nodded respectfully, acknowledging her without immediately responding, because I knew this was not about intention, it was about impact. And I chose my words carefully. I understand that, I replied calmly, but when something is said publicly, it shapes how people understand the reality behind it, and I did not raise my voice, I did not add pressure, I simply allowed the statement to stand on its own, and that made it harder to dismiss, because it was not emotional, it was precise. And my father leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful now, no longer questioning whether I was correct, but considering what it meant moving forward, and my sister, who had been quiet for several seconds, finally spoke again, but this time there was less confidence in her tone. You are making it sound like I have no role in this, she said, and I turned to her gently, not confrontational, not dismissive. That is not what I am saying, I replied, maintaining the same level of respect. You have a role, and you have contributed, but it is important to recognize how the structure supports that role, and I could see the tension in her expression shift slightly, not disappearing, but changing, because she was no longer defending a clear position. She was trying to hold on to something that was becoming more complicated in front of an audience that now understood more than they had before, and one of my uncles, who had remained silent until now, spoke quietly. So the company depends on both of you, and I nodded once, acknowledging the attempt to balance the narrative, but I clarified without hesitation, it operates because the structure allows it to, I said, keeping my tone even, and that structure was designed with specific controls in place, and again, I did not need to elaborate further, because the implication was already understood, and the room remained still, not uncomfortable in the way it had been earlier, but focused, attentive, as if everyone was recalibrating their understanding in real time, and my mother looked at me again, this time without the earlier confidence, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not just concern, but recognition, as if she was beginning to see the situation from a perspective she had overlooked, and she spoke more carefully now. "We are proud of both of you," she said, trying to restore balance, trying to soften what had already been said, but the words did not carry the same authority they had at the beginning of the evening, because the context had changed, and I acknowledged her again with a small nod, not rejecting her statement, but not reinforcing it either, because I knew the moment was no longer about reassurance, it was about clarity, and my father exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the table as he looked between my sister and me, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but deliberate. "This should have been discussed privately," and I met his gaze calmly. "It could have been," I replied, "but the conversation became public before I had the chance, and I did not say it with accusation, only with fact, and that distinction mattered, because it placed responsibility back where it belonged without escalating the situation." And for a moment, no one responded, not because they did not have anything to say, but because they were now aware of how the situation had unfolded, and that awareness changed how they chose to react. And my sister looked down briefly before lifting her gaze again, her expression more controlled now, but no longer confident, and my mother remained quiet, her earlier certainty replaced by a measured silence, and I stayed composed, exactly as I had been from the beginning, because this was not about winning an argument, it was about correcting a narrative, and once that was done, there was nothing more I needed to prove. The shift had already taken place, and everyone at that table knew it, whether they chose to acknowledge it out loud or not. By then, the room had settled into a kind of silence that did not need to be filled, the kind where everyone understands something important has already happened and anything said after that has to be chosen carefully, and I could feel the shift in how people were looking at me, not with curiosity anymore, but with a level of respect that had not been there before, and that change was not loud, it was subtle, but it was real. And I remained still, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the table, because I had no need to push further. The point had already been made, and that was when my sister spoke again, but this time her voice was quieter, more controlled, almost cautious. "So what exactly are you trying to say, Tige?" she asked, and the way she said my name was different now, not dismissive, not superior, but measured, as if she was trying to understand the boundaries she had not seen before. And I looked at her calmly, meeting her eyes without tension. "I am not trying to say anything new," I replied, my tone even and respectful. "I am only clarifying what has always been there," and I let that settle without adding anything unnecessary, because clarity does not need to be repeated, and my mother shifted slightly in her seat, her hands now folded together as she looked between us, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful attention, and she spoke again, but there was no longer any attempt to control the narrative, only to understand it. "Then why bring it up now?" she asked softly, and I answered without hesitation, "Because it was presented in a way that removed important context," I said, "and I believe accuracy matters, especially in a room like this," and I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize the statement, I simply let it exist as fact, and my father nodded once. Slowly, as if he agreed with the reasoning even if he had not expected the outcome, and one of the guests at the far end of the table finally spoke, breaking the silence in a different way this time, not to challenge, but to process. "So the success we are hearing about," he said carefully, "was not entirely independent," and I answered with the same steady tone. "It was supported by a structure that ensured it could succeed." And again, I did not diminish my sister's effort, I did not elevate myself beyond what was necessary, I simply placed the truth where it belonged, and that made it impossible to ignore. And my sister exhaled quietly, leaning back in her chair now, her earlier posture gone, replaced by something more restrained, and she said, "You could have said this privately," and I nodded, acknowledging her point without resisting it. "That would have been possible," I replied, "if the conversation had remained private." And there was no sharpness in my words, only consistency, and that consistency made it clear that I was not reacting emotionally, I was responding logically. And my mother lowered her gaze for a moment before looking back up, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something it had not at the beginning of the evening, not authority, but reflection. "We should have been more careful," she said quietly, and I inclined my head slightly, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because that was all that was needed, and no one rushed to continue the conversation after that. No one tried to fill the silence with forced laughter or quick subject changes, because the atmosphere had changed too much for that, and I remained composed, not because I was trying to hold control, but because I had already established it without effort, and I understood that this moment was not about continuing to speak, it was about allowing the realization to fully settle, and sometimes that requires restraint more than words, so I did not add anything further, I did not revisit what had already been said, I simply sat there, calm and present, letting the room adjust to a version of the story that no longer excluded me, and in that quiet, I knew something had shifted permanently, not just in how they saw the situation, but in how they saw me, and that change did not need to be announced, it was already understood by everyone at that table. No one rushed to speak after that, and for a moment it felt like the evening might quietly move on, like everyone would accept the correction and retreat into safer conversation, but I had learned that silence in my family often meant something unresolved was still waiting underneath, and I was not interested in leaving anything half-said this time, so I reached for my glass, not to drink, but to give myself a second to choose how to continue, and when I set it back down, I spoke again, just as calmly as before. There is one more thing I should probably clarify, I said, and that single sentence was enough to bring every bit of attention back to me, sharper than before, because now they understood that when I spoke, it was not casual, it was deliberate, and my sister straightened slightly, her expression tightening again as if she was trying to anticipate what I would say next, and my mother looked at me with a kind of quiet concern, not interrupting this time, not attempting to redirect, just watching. And my father's gaze remained steady, focused, waiting, and I continued without raising my voice. The structure we discussed earlier was not only designed to support the company, I said, it was designed to protect it from risk, including internal risk, and that word, internal, landed differently, because it shifted the conversation from past contributions to present accountability, and I could feel the tension rise again, not chaotic, but controlled, like a room holding its breath, and my sister spoke immediately this time, her tone sharper. What is that supposed to mean? She asked, and I turned to her calmly, not reacting to the tone, only to the question. It means that certain decisions require oversight before they are finalized, I replied, and I kept my wording precise, measured, not accusatory, just factual, and recently, there have been attempts to move assets without that process being followed, and this time the reaction was immediate, not loud, but visible. My sister's expression changed completely, not just tension, but something closer to alarm, and my mother's eyes widened slightly as she looked between us, clearly not aware of what I had just referenced, and my father leaned forward, his attention sharpening. What kind of attempts? He asked, his voice lower now, more serious, and I met his gaze evenly. There was a request filed last week to reassign a portion of the company's operating funds, I said, without proper authorization, and I did not look away. I did not soften the statement, I simply let it stand, and the room reacted in silence, not confusion this time, but recognition that something significant had just been revealed, and my sister shook her head quickly, her composure slipping for the first time that evening. That is not accurate, she said, but her voice did not carry the same confidence it had before, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging her response without challenging it directly. The request was documented, I replied calmly, and it was flagged before any changes were made, and I kept my tone neutral, because this was not about confrontation, it was about transparency, and my mother spoke again, her voice quieter now. Why would that happen? She asked, and I answered simply, I believe it was a misunderstanding of the process, and that was intentional, because I was not there to accuse, I was there to clarify, but the impact of the information did not depend on how I framed it, it depended on what it implied. And that implication had already settled across the table, and my father exhaled slowly, his expression tightening as he processed what he had just heard, and my sister remained silent now. Her earlier arguments gone, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than anything she had said, and I did not press further, I did not add more details, because I did not need to, the point had already been made, and adding more would have turned it into something else, something louder, something less controlled, and that was not my intention. So I leaned back slightly in my chair, returning to the same composed posture I had maintained all evening, and allowed the silence to settle once again, because sometimes the strongest statement is the one you do not extend, the one you allow others to fully understand on their own, and in that moment, I knew the conversation had gone far beyond where anyone at that table had expected it to go, and there was no way to return to the version of the evening they had started with. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was heavy and undeniable, the kind that settles into a room when something has been exposed that cannot be ignored, and I could see it in the way no one reached for their glass, no one adjusted their seat, no one even attempted to shift the conversation away from what had just been said, and my sister was the first to move, but not with the same composure she had earlier, her posture stiff, her expression carefully controlled but no longer confident, and she said quietly, "That was not finalized," as if that alone could reduce the weight of what had just been revealed, and I nodded once, acknowledging her point without conceding anything. "It was not," I replied calmly, "because it was reviewed before approval," and I kept my tone neutral, not escalating, not softening, just clear, and that clarity seemed to land harder than anything else, because it left no room for interpretation, and my mother let out a slow breath, her hands now resting flat against the table, her earlier authority completely gone, replaced by a visible discomfort she could not mask, and she spoke carefully, "We were not aware of that," and I looked at her with the same steady respect I had maintained all evening. "I understand," I said, which is why I felt it was important to clarify, and I did not add anything beyond that, because the purpose had already been achieved, and my father shifted forward, his voice lower now, more controlled than before. "Is there any risk to the company because of this?" he asked, and I answered without hesitation. "There is no immediate risk," I said, because the safeguards worked exactly as they were designed to, and I allowed a brief pause before continuing, "But situations like that are the reason those safeguards exist," and I could see the meaning settle in again, not just as information, but as realization, that the structure they had overlooked was not theoretical, it was active, it was necessary, and it had already prevented something from happening, and my sister looked down briefly before meeting my gaze again, her voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence she had carried at the beginning of the evening. "You could have told me directly," she said, and I did not reject that. I simply answered, "I expected the process to be followed," and there was no accusation in my tone, only consistency, and that made it harder to challenge. Because I was not assigning blame, I was pointing to a standard that had already been agreed upon, and my mother closed her eyes for a brief second before opening them again, as if she was trying to reset her understanding of everything that had just happened, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it in a setting like this. "We should have listened more carefully before speaking," and I inclined my head slightly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acknowledgement, because this was not about correcting her again. It was about allowing her to reach that conclusion on her own, and no one interrupted her, no one rushed to defend what had been said earlier, because there was nothing left to defend. The situation had already moved beyond that point, and one of the guests who had been silent the entire time finally spoke, his tone measured, almost cautious. "It sounds like there is more behind this than we realized," and I answered simply, "There is always more behind a structure than what is visible," and I did not elaborate, because I did not need to. The statement itself was enough, and the room absorbed it without resistance, and my sister remained still, her earlier presence diminished, not by anything I had done aggressively, but by the weight of what had been revealed calmly, precisely, and without emotion, and my father leaned back again, his expression no longer questioning, but resolved, as if he had accepted a version of reality that he had not considered before, and my mother stayed quiet, her earlier certainty replaced by a thoughtful silence that did not seek to interrupt or redirect, and I remained composed, exactly as I had been from the beginning, not because I was trying to maintain control, but because I no longer needed to. The control had already shifted on its own, and everyone at that table could feel it, not as tension, but as a quiet understanding that the story they had started the evening with was no longer the one they were leaving with. No one tried to restart the dinner after that, and that was what made the ending so clear, because there was no dramatic argument, no raised voices, no sudden confrontation, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted and could not be undone, and I could see it in the way people slowly leaned back in their chairs, no longer waiting for a resolution, but accepting that the resolution had already happened, just not in the way they expected, and my mother remained still for a moment longer before finally speaking, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "Tige," she said, and there was no authority in it this time, only something closer to hesitation. as if she was choosing her words carefully for the first time. "We did not realize how much you were carrying behind the scenes," and I looked at her calmly, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. "It was never about carrying anything," I replied, "it was about making sure things worked the way they were supposed to," and I did not elaborate further, because the explanation was not meant to justify myself, it was simply meant to close the gap between what they believed and what was true, and my father nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You should have said something earlier," he added, and I met his gaze evenly. "I believed it would be understood without needing to be said," I answered, and there was no accusation in my tone, only a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes understanding does not come unless it is forced into the open, and my sister remained quiet for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice lower now, stripped of the confidence she had started the evening with. "I did not think it would come across like that," she said, and I turned to her gently, not dismissive, not confrontational. "Perception matters," I replied, "especially when it is shared with others," and I could see her absorb that, not resisting it, not arguing, just sitting with it, and that was enough, because this was not about forcing an apology, it was about changing awareness, and once that awareness exists, everything else follows on its own. And one of the guests quietly excused himself from the table, not abruptly, just respectfully, as if he understood that the evening had reached a natural conclusion even without a formal ending, and others began to follow, slowly, conversations resuming in softer tones, no longer centered on my sister, no longer carrying the same assumptions they had walked in with, and I remained seated for a moment longer, not because I needed to stay, but because I wanted to allow the shift to fully settle before I moved, and when I finally stood, it was without urgency, without tension, just a simple decision to step away from a situation that no longer required my presence, and my mother looked up at me as I did, her expression no longer certain, no longer dismissive, but reflective, and she said quietly, "We will talk about this later," and I gave a small nod, not committing, not refusing, just acknowledging the statement for what it was, and my father did the same, his earlier distance replaced by a measured respect he had not shown before, and my sister watched me for a second longer than the others. Her expression unreadable, not defensive, not confident, just thoughtful in a way I had never seen from her before, and I did not wait for anything more, I did not ask for recognition, I did not ask for apology. Because I understood something in that moment that I had not fully accepted before, that recognition given under pressure is not the same as understanding earned through clarity, and what mattered was not what they said next, it was what they would no longer be able to ignore, so I walked toward the door without hesitation, not as someone leaving in defeat, and not as someone claiming victory, but as someone who had finally corrected the story that had been told about her for far too long, and as I stepped outside into the quiet air, I realized that the most powerful part of the evening was not the moment I spoke, it was the moment I no longer needed to say anything at all, because the truth had already done the rest.